3 days. That's how long modern survival experts say a human can last without water. But the Bedouins? They stretched it to weeks. Not through luck. Not through some biological miracle. Through knowledge. Ancient, precise, and unforgiving. Knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death under a sun that showed no mercy. The desert is a place where water doesn't just sustain life. It is life. Every drop. Every decision. One mistake and you're gone. But for centuries, Bedouin tribes crossed hundreds of kilometers through landscapes where rain might not fall for years. Where wells were days apart. Where a single miscalculation meant your bones would join the others bleaching in the sand. They didn't just survive. They mastered it. And their methods, refined over generations, reveal a level of environmental intelligence that most of us have forgotten. In an age where climate extremes are becoming the norm, these aren't just historical curiosities. They're survival blueprints. The desert looks empty to the untrained eye. An endless expanse of sand and rock, stretching to the horizon. Flat, barren, lifeless. But to a Bedouin, it was anything but empty. It was covered in signs, a language written in the shape of dunes, the direction of wind, the color of sand, and the behavior of every living thing that dared to exist there. Water was invisible, but never truly hidden. You just had to know how to read the desert's secrets. Before any journey across the waterless void, Bedouins engaged in a practice that seems almost mythical now. They memorized the entire route. Not on paper, not on maps. In their minds. Every well, every spring, every possible water source was cataloged with precision that would shame modern GPS systems. They knew the exact distance between water points. They knew which wells were deep, which were shallow, which had sweet water, which had brackish. They knew who dug them, when they were dug, and whether they were still producing. This wasn't casual knowledge. It was survival data, passed down through generations like sacred scripture. A Bedouin could tell you that from point A to point B, there were exactly 7 wells. The first was 3 meters deep, dug by a man named Bintuk 40 years ago. The third was 5 meters, but the water tasted slightly salty. The fifth was the best, cool, sweet, and reliable even in the driest months. This mental map covered thousands of square kilometers. Lose this knowledge, and you were as good as dead. The wells themselves were monuments to human endurance. Dug entirely by hand. Often by a single man working alone for 4 to 5 months straight. Some reached 10 meters deep, the height of a 3-story building, carved through sand, rock, and hard-packed earth with nothing but simple tools. The digger would descend into the hole each day, scooping out earth in milk bowls, hauling it up in goatskin bags, meter by meter, day after day, until his hand struck water. These wells were named after their creators, not as vanity, but as navigation markers. Meet me at Bin Balash's well, told you exactly where to go. Even after a well dried up, and many did, the name remained on the land, a ghost marker for desert travelers to orient themselves by. But what happened when you were between wells? When your water ran out, and the next source was 3 days away? That's when the real knowledge separated the living from the dead. The Bedouins knew something crucial. Water doesn't just disappear. It hides. Wadis, those ancient, dried riverbeds snaking through the desert, became their hunting grounds. To an outsider, a wadi looks as dead as the sand around it. Bone dry, cracked earth, not a drop in sight. But underneath, that's where water played its hiding game. The Bedouins knew exactly where to dig. Not randomly, not everywhere. At the outer bends of the wadi's curve, where the ancient river would have flowed slowest and water would have been the last to drain away. At the lowest depressions, where gravity pulled every last bit of moisture. They'd dig down half a meter, sometimes deeper. And often, they'd strike damp sand. Sometimes actual water pooling in the hole. Other times just mud. Thick, wet earth that could be pressed through cloth, squeezed drop by precious drop into a container. It wasn't pleasant water. It was often brown, cloudy, filled with sediment. But it was water. And in the desert, clean or dirty doesn't matter. Wet or dry does. If the sand they struck was wet with a dry layer beneath it, they knew immediately. The water had already drained deeper or evaporated. So they'd move downhill and try again. Lower ground. Deeper holes. Following the water's invisible path through layers of sand and soil. Sometimes they used an ancient technique that sounds almost supernatural. the sound test. They'd lift a heavy stone, as big as they could manage, and drop it hard against the earth. Then they'd crouch down, ear to the ground, and listen. If there was a hollow echo, a resonance that traveled through the soil, it meant there was space below, a cavity. And cavities in desert soil often meant water, trapped between layers of rock or packed earth. Only then would they commit to the exhausting work of digging a water scrape. A water scrape could be as deep as a man's height, dug with basic tools, using milk bowls as shovels when the earth grew too packed for hands. They'd descend into this pit, hauling up sand and rock, going deeper until moisture appeared. Then they'd use those same milk bowls and goatskin bags to draw the water up, scoop by scoop, filling their containers for the journey ahead. But digging was a last resort. Better to let the desert show you where the water was. They watched birds like hawks watching prey. Songbirds, doves, honeybees. None of these creatures strayed far from water. At dawn and dusk especially, when the desert air was coolest and animals were most active, the Bedouins would scan the sky. A flock circling in the distance, twittering and diving? Head that direction. Birds gliding in formation toward a specific point? Follow them. Where birds gathered, water existed. Maybe not on the surface, but close enough to sustain life. Close enough to dig for. Palm trees were even more reliable. A single palm standing in the middle of nowhere wasn't random. It was a sign. Palms needed water to survive, and they sent roots deep to find it. If a palm was alive, water was beneath it, usually within a few feet of the base. The Bedouins would dig there, and almost always, they'd find it. Green vegetation of any kind was a beacon. In a landscape of brown and tan, a patch of green meant moisture. Not surface water necessarily, but a water table close enough that plants could tap it. The Bedouins knew that where plants thrived, digging wouldn't be in vain. Deep dune valleys were another secret reservoir. When rare rains did fall, water rushed down the slopes and collected in these depressions. But it didn't just sit there to evaporate. It seeped down, infiltrating the sand, settling between different layers of soil where it was protected from the sun's relentless evaporation. Months after the rain stopped, water was still down there. You just had to know where to dig and how deep to go. And then there were the camels. Those long-legged, strange-eyed creatures that seemed purpose-built for the desert's cruelty. They weren't just transportation. They were water detectors. A camel could smell water from kilometers away. When one caught the scent, everything changed. Its pace would quicken. Its nostrils would flare. Its eyes would fix on a direction with single-minded determination. Sometimes it would become almost frantic, fighting to move toward the source. The Bedouins learned to read this behavior like a compass. When your camel suddenly came alive, straining towards something you couldn't see, you didn't question it. You followed, because that animal's nose was more reliable than any human instinct. The desert wasn't empty. It was full of information, full of signs and signals and patterns that, once learned, turned an alien wasteland into a readable map. The Bedouins didn't have technology. They had something better. Generational knowledge, refined by survival, tested by death, proven by the fact that they were still here, still crossing these killing grounds, still finding water where none seemed to exist. If water was the currency of desert survival, then camels were the bank, the vault, the entire financial system. Without camels, there would be no Bedouins. Not as we know them. The relationship wasn't one of convenience or preference. It was absolute dependence. These animals were so fundamental to desert life that ancient poets called them the gift of God and the ship of the desert. Not metaphors, literal descriptions of survival. A camel's biology reads like it was designed by someone who understood the desert's specific cruelty. Every adaptation, every feature, every quirk of their physiology was a response to a landscape trying to kill them. Start with water. A camel could drink 100 liters in 8 minutes. 100 liters. That's more than most people drink in a month, consumed in less time than it takes to make coffee. They'd plunge their mouths into wells, drinking with an intensity that would sometimes break wooden troughs or tip over containers. The Bedouins learned to sing or chant while their camels drank, believing it helped them consume their fill, a rhythm that kept them calm and drinking steadily. But it wasn't about storage, despite the myth. Camels don't store water in their humps. That's fat, pure energy reserve. The water they drank distributed throughout their bodies in a system so efficient it borders on miraculous. Their blood cells are oval-shaped, not round, allowing them to flow even when the animal is severely dehydrated. Their kidneys can tolerate water loss exceeding 30% of body mass. In humans, 15% is fatal. In most mammals, 20% means death. Camels, 30%, and they're uncomfortable but alive. In summer, with temperatures soaring past 45 degrees, a camel could go 5 to 7 days without water. In winter, when they could graze on moisture-rich plants, that stretched to 50 days. 50 days. Some Bedouins would leave their camels to pasture during spring, and the animals would wander for weeks, eating their fill, then find their way home when the grazing exhausted, without being watered once. But for Bedouins crossing waterless expanses, the camel's water capacity was only part of the equation. There was something more valuable: milk. Camel milk was liquid survival, rich in fat, protein, vitamins, with natural antiseptic properties that kept it from spoiling quickly in the heat. A Bedouin family could survive for weeks on camel milk alone. No food, no water, just milk. It replaced both. The fat provided energy. The liquid provided hydration. The nutrients kept you functional. Mother camels with young were particularly valuable. They could be milked daily, sometimes twice daily, producing enough to sustain an entire traveling family. While water had to be rationed, measured, carefully preserved, milk was renewable. As long as the camel had something to graze on, even the toughest, thorniest desert scrub, she would produce milk. And that milk would keep humans alive. In desperate situations, when water supplies completely ran out and death was imminent, Bedouins had one final option. They would slaughter a camel and drain the water from its stomach. It sounds brutal. It was brutal, but it was calculated survival mathematics. One camel's death could mean life for 5, 6, 7 people. The water in a camel's stomach wasn't clean. It was mixed with partially digested plant matter, thick, greenish, foul-smelling. But it was water. And when you're dying of thirst, watching your children's lips crack and bleed, watching delirium set in, you don't think about taste or cleanliness. You think about the next 24 hours. You think about making it to the next well. The Bedouins didn't make this choice lightly. Camels were wealth. A good camel could cost what a family might earn in months or years. Killing one was a massive economic loss. But the economics of death are simpler. No amount of wealth matters if you're not alive to spend it. Beyond survival resources, camels possess something that seemed almost supernatural: memory. A camel never forgot a water source. Once shown a well, a spring, a wadi where they dug for water, a camel remembered it. Forever. Years could pass. The landscape could shift, dunes could migrate, vegetation could change. Didn't matter. That camel remembered where the water was. This became a navigation tool that saved countless lives. Bedouins who became disoriented, from sandstorms, from heat exhaustion, from simply losing track in the featureless expanse, would sometimes do something that seems insane. They'd drop the reins and let the camel choose the direction. Stories passed through generations tell of men wandering delirious with thirst, convinced they were going to die, making peace with God. Then they'd release their grip on the reins, too exhausted to guide anymore. And the camel would turn. Pick a direction. Start walking with purpose. Hours later, the man would find himself at a well, or back at camp, or at a wadi he'd visited months before and forgotten. The camel hadn't forgotten. This wasn't luck or mysticism. It was biology. Camels have excellent long-term memory, particularly for locations associated with survival needs. Their brains literally mapped water sources, creating an internal geography that functioned like GPS long before satellites existed. But perhaps the most crucial skill was the Bedouins' ability to read their camel's condition. These animals were hardy, but not invincible, and they showed stress differently than humans. Understanding those signals meant the difference between pushing forward and stopping before disaster struck. A camel's breathing rate was the primary indicator. Under normal conditions, they breathed slowly, calmly, their long necks rising and falling in steady rhythm. But when the heat became dangerous, when even a camel's remarkable cooling system was overwhelmed, their breathing would accelerate. They'd start panting, mouths open, breath coming in shorter cycles. This was the warning sign. When a camel started breathing faster, It meant conditions had reached critical levels. And if a camel, built for desert survival, adapted over millennia to withstand heat that would kill most creatures, was struggling, what chance did a human have? The Bedouins learned to monitor this constantly. They'd watch their animals while riding, glancing down at their necks, listening to the rhythm of breath. The moment that rhythm changed, they'd stop, find shade, wait out the worst heat. They didn't need thermometers or weather reports. The camel told them everything they needed to know. Behavior changes were another signal. A normally docile camel becoming agitated, fighting the reins, trying to change direction. That usually meant it had caught the scent of water. But a camel becoming lethargic, moving slower, resisting commands in a sluggish way rather than an active way, meant dehydration was setting in. Time to stop. Time to share whatever water remained. Time to reassess whether continuing was suicide. The relationship wasn't just practical. It was emotional. Bedouins treated their camels like family members. They gave them names, talked to them, slept near them at night. Not from sentiment, but from survival. In the desert, your camel's well-being was your well-being. If it died, you probably died. If it thrived, you had a chance. When a camel finally reached water after days of deprivation, the Bedouins wouldn't just let it drink unchecked. Despite the animal's eagerness, despite its desperate thirst, they'd control the intake. Too much water too fast could make a severely dehydrated camel sick. So they'd let it drink in stages, singing to keep it calm, pulling it back periodically, then allowing more. Patience. Even in desperate thirst, patience. This was the Bedouin way. Understanding that survival wasn't about fighting the desert or fighting your animals or fighting nature. It was about reading the signs, responding with precision, and treating every resource, especially living ones, with the respect that kept everyone alive. When the wells ran dry, when the wadis yielded nothing, when even the camels couldn't smell water within 100 kilometers, the Bedouins didn't give up. They turned to sources so subtle, so seemingly impossible, that modern survivalists barely believe they work. They harvested water from the air itself. Dew. It sounds absurd. Droplets of moisture condensing on rocks and fabric, so small you can barely see them individually. How could that sustain human life? How could that possibly be enough? The answer, it had to be. And through centuries of observation and experimentation, the Bedouins figured out how. Desert nights are cold. When the sun disappears, temperatures can plummet 30 degrees or more. The air holds moisture, not much, but some, and when temperatures drop below the dew point, that invisible vapor becomes visible liquid. It settles on any cold surface it touches. Rocks, plants, fabric, sand. It doesn't last long. The moment the sun rises, evaporation begins. Within an hour of sunrise, it's all gone. The Bedouins learned to work in that narrow window. Just before dawn, while darkness still covered the desert, they'd dig up stones. Not just any stones. Ones that had been buried or shaded, ones that were coldest. They positioned these in open areas where air circulation was good, where moisture could settle. Then they'd wait. As the first hint of light appeared on the horizon, condensation would begin. Tiny droplets forming on the stone's surface, growing, joining together. If you watched closely, you could see the rock's surface darken as water accumulated. The Bedouins would move quickly then, before the sun cleared the horizon. They'd wipe the moisture off with cloth, wring it into containers, or simply lick the stones clean, getting the water directly. Not dignified, but effective. In good conditions, high humidity, clear cold nights, they could collect over 1 liter per hour this way. 1 liter doesn't sound like much. But when you've been rationing water so severely that you're measuring intake in sips, 1 liter is abundance. 1 liter is another day of life. The technique required perfect timing. Too early, and not enough dew had formed. Too late, and the rising sun would evaporate it before you could collect. They'd watch the horizon, judge the light level, move in that precise moment when collection was optimal. Women particularly mastered dew collection. During winter months, when humidity was higher, they'd go out before dawn with large pieces of thick cloth. They'd spread these over areas with dense low vegetation, places where moisture would be trapped close to the ground. The cloth would absorb the dew as it formed on plants. After an hour, the fabric would be soaking wet. They'd gather it up, wring it out over containers, or directly into their mouths. One piece of cloth, properly positioned, could yield half a liter or more. This wasn't casual work. It required waking hours before sunrise, working in the dark cold, moving fast before the sun destroyed what you'd waited all night to collect. But in a landscape where water was life, this work was everything. The goatskin water bags, burdocks, were another piece of desert engineering that modern people barely understand. Most containers try to prevent evaporation. Sealed lids. Airtight construction. The goal is to keep every drop contained. Burdocks did the opposite. They were deliberately porous, made from the complete hide of a goat, sewn shut with only a small opening for filling and drinking. These bags had tiny gaps between the leather fibers. Air could pass through. More importantly, moisture could pass through. As water inside the burdocks seeped to the surface, just tiny amounts, barely enough to measure, it would evaporate. Evaporation creates cooling. It's the same principle behind sweating, behind evaporative coolers, behind every natural cooling system on Earth. Water turns to vapor, and that phase change requires energy. It pulls heat from whatever it's touching. In this case, the water inside the bag. The result: water inside a burdock could be 10 to 12 degrees cooler than the air temperature around it. When the outside temperature was 50 degrees, hot enough to cause burns on exposed skin, the water inside might be 38 degrees. Not cold, not refreshing by normal standards, but dramatically cooler than what surrounded you. Drinkable without scorching your throat. Cool enough to actually hydrate rather than just add warm liquid to an overheating body. The drier the air, the more effective this became. In the heart of summer, when humidity dropped to almost nothing and the desert felt like an oven, burdocks worked best. The water would practically beg to evaporate, pulling heat out aggressively, keeping the contents as cool as physically possible without refrigeration. Yes, you lost some water to evaporation, but what remained was usable. A sealed container in direct sunlight would heat water to temperatures that made drinking it dangerous. The burdocks sacrificed a small amount to preserve the rest. Underground storage was another technique that seems too simple to work, but it did. Temperature drops dramatically just below the desert surface. On the top layer of sand, you might measure 60 degrees in direct sun. Dig down 30 centimeters, and it might be 45 degrees. At 50 centimeters, maybe 35 or 40. Not cold, but significantly cooler. Cool enough to slow evaporation, preserve moisture, keep food from spoiling as fast. The Bedouins would dig shallow pits wherever they camped for more than a few hours, just deep enough to get below the heat-soaked surface layer. They'd place their water skins in these holes, cover them with rugs or sacks to block direct sunlight, pile sand over everything. The water would stay cooler, last longer, lose less to evaporation. Food went underground too. Dates, dried meat, milk products, anything that heat would ruin. The pit became a natural refrigerator, no electricity required. A family might dig multiple pits around their tent, creating an entire underground storage system that kept supplies viable through the brutal summer months. They knew where to find hidden cisterns too. Ancient peoples traveling these same routes had dug storage systems, covered them to prevent evaporation and protect them from animals, then moved on. Some of these cisterns were centuries old, but the Bedouins had learned the patterns. Where would desperate travelers dig? Where would water naturally collect? Where would someone hide a precious reserve? They'd search under slopes, behind large rocks, in shallow trenches along cliff faces. They'd look for depressions where rainwater would pool, for hard-packed soil that might cover a man-made reservoir. Often they'd find nothing. But sometimes, after digging through a meter of earth and sand, they'd break through to an underground chamber. Stone-lined walls, clay-sealed bottom, and sometimes, miraculously, water still inside. Stagnant, probably unsafe, but better than dying. In the most extreme situations, they turn to plants. Not for drinking directly. Most desert plants are toxic or make you sicker than you already are. But certain species stored moisture in their roots. Shallow roots, close to the surface, swollen with liquid. They'd dig these up, cut them into sections, press or squeeze them, extract whatever fluid they held. A few milliliters from each root. Barely enough to wet your tongue. But when you're measuring survival in hours, those milliliters matter. None of these techniques were easy. None provided abundance. But together, they formed a survival web that could keep you alive when every obvious source had failed. The Bedouins didn't need a single great solution. They needed 10, 20, 50 small solutions. Each one bought another day, another handful of hours, another chance to reach real water. But the most critical survival skill had nothing to do with finding water. It was about not losing what you already had. Water discipline in the desert wasn't a suggestion. It wasn't advice. It was law. The kind of law where breaking it meant you died. And the Bedouins had refined this discipline into an art form practiced with religious precision. The first rule: never drink when you're thirsty. That sounds backwards. Thirst is your body's signal that you need water, right? But in the desert, thirst means you've already started failing. By the time you feel thirsty, you're already dehydrated. Your body is already suffering. You're already behind. The Bedouins drank on schedule, not on feeling. Small amounts, spread throughout the day, keeping hydration levels stable rather than letting them drop and trying to recover. Prevention, not treatment. But more importantly, they understood that how you drank mattered as much as when. Big gulps were suicide. Swallowing large amounts of water triggered immediate responses in your body that actually made dehydration worse. Your stomach would expand, signaling fullness. Your kidneys would activate, processing the sudden influx. Your cooling system would engage, promoting sweating to regulate the temperature shift. All of that used water. All of that wasted the resource you'd just consumed. Instead, small sips. Just enough to moisten the mouth and throat. Hold it there. Let the tissues absorb moisture directly. Swallow slowly. Wait. Another small sip. This method hydrated more efficiently because it minimized the body's panic response. Your organs stayed calm. Your cooling system stayed quiet. The water went where it was needed without triggering waste. Even in desperate thirst, lips cracked, tongue swollen, throat burning, the discipline held. Small sips. Slow consumption. If you broke and chugged water, you'd feel better for minutes, then crash harder. The momentary relief wasn't worth the increased fluid loss that followed. Their bodies had adapted over generations. Medical research confirms that people acclimatized to desert conditions can tolerate greater dehydration than those from temperate climates. The Bedouins could function at hydration levels that would incapacitate someone inured to the heat. Some estimates suggest they could last 24 hours longer than the average person in identical conditions. But adaptation only went so far. The real secret was behavioral control that bordered on supernatural. Movement generated heat. Heat triggered sweating. Sweating depleted water. Therefore, minimize movement. From mid-morning to late afternoon, roughly 9 a.m. to 5 p.m., the Bedouins would enter a state that looked like death. They'd find whatever shade existed, lie down, and stop. Not just stop moving. Stop everything. Conversation ceased. Eating stopped. Even thinking slowed. They'd wrap themselves in fabric despite the heat, creating a barrier between their skin and the superheated air. They'd close their eyes. They'd breathe slowly through their noses, never their mouths. And they'd remain motionless for hours. Watching them, you'd wonder if they were still alive. But inside their bodies, a calculated shutdown was preserving every possible resource. Heart rate dropped. Metabolism slowed. Sweat production minimized. Blood flow reduced to non-essential areas. They essentially entered a low-power mode, like electronics conserving battery. Every system that could be throttled back was throttled back. Because every system running consumed resources, and resources were measured in drops of water they couldn't afford to lose. Even their breathing was calculated. Slow, steady, through the nose exclusively. Breathing through your mouth loses dramatically more moisture. Every exhale carries water vapor out of your body. Mouth breathing accelerates this. Nose breathing slows it. The mucous membranes in your nasal passages recover some of that moisture before it exits. Not much, but enough that over hours, over days, it made a measurable difference. They trained themselves to pause after exhaling. Hold empty lungs. Let the carbon dioxide build slightly before inhaling again. This reduced their respiratory rate further, losing less moisture per breath. It's a technique that takes practice. Most people panic when they hold their breath. The Bedouins learned to stay calm, to trust the process, to understand that slower breathing meant longer survival. Sleep was segmented. They didn't rest in one long unconscious block like modern people do. They doze for short periods, wake naturally, assess the environment, doze again. This pattern kept them aware of changes, wind shifts, temperature drops, approaching sounds. But it also prevented the deep sleep state where the body relaxes completely, and sweating increases. Light sleep, frequent waking, constant low-level awareness. Food intake was ruthlessly controlled. Digestion requires water. Your body needs fluid to process food, to break down nutrients, to move waste through your system. The heavier the meal, the more water required. So during water scarcity, they ate as little as possible. A few dates, some milk if available, maybe a piece of flatbread, just enough to keep the body functional. Starvation was bad, but it killed slower than dehydration. Given a choice between eating and preserving water, they chose water every time. They avoided anything that increased thirst. Salt was rationed carefully. Fried food was avoided. Spices were minimal. Hot foods, temperature-wise, were rejected because they raised body temperature, triggering sweating. Meals were bland, simple, small, and consumed only after sunset when the body's cooling demands decreased. But perhaps the most crucial discipline was psychological. Panic was lethal. Fear triggers adrenaline. Adrenaline accelerates heart rate. Faster heart rate increases blood flow. Increased blood flow raises body temperature. Higher temperature causes sweating. More sweating means more water loss. Fear, quite literally, could kill you through dehydration. The Bedouins learned to control their minds like they controlled their bodies. Stay calm. No matter how dire the situation, no matter how lost you felt, no matter how empty your water skin was, stay calm. Breathe slowly. Think clearly. Make decisions from a place of rational assessment, not emotional reaction. This wasn't about being tough or brave. It was about physiology. Your mental state directly impacts your physical resource consumption. Anxiety burns water faster than walking. Stress sweats more than labor. Keeping your mind calm kept your body efficient. They practiced this from childhood. Learning to sit still in heat. Learning to ignore thirst signals. Learning to tolerate discomfort without panic. By the time someone was old enough to make long desert crossings, this discipline was so ingrained it was automatic. They didn't have to think about staying calm. They just were calm. Even facing death, they remained controlled. When cooling was absolutely necessary, they didn't waste water on their entire body. That was inefficient. Instead, targeted cooling. The wrists, the neck, the face. These areas have high concentrations of blood vessels close to the skin surface. Cool them, and you cool the blood flowing through them. That cooled blood circulates through the body, lowering overall temperature with minimal water use. A few drops on the inside of your wrists. A damp cloth on the back of your neck. Moisture on your temples and forehead. It felt like nothing, but it could drop your core temperature by a degree or two. Enough to reduce sweating. Enough to extend survival time. The Bedouins didn't conquer the desert. They didn't fight it. They didn't try to impose human will on an environment that crushed human will routinely. Instead, they adapted. They learned. They became part of the desert's patterns rather than fighting against them. Their survival wasn't about strength. It was about precision. About knowing that in a place where water is everything, discipline is the difference between life and death. Every sip measured. Every movement calculated. Every breath controlled. These weren't just techniques. They were a way of existing. A complete system of behavior, refined over generations, tested by the harshest environment on Earth. And the fact that Bedouin culture persisted for centuries in these conditions is proof that the system worked. Not comfortably, not easily, but it worked.